Stick to vending machine duty since critical thinking seems beyond your scope. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 43 minutes before the man in room 412 flatlined and exposed everything the arrogant physician had built. Laura Bennett moves through St. Michael's fluorescent corridors in Atlanta with the economical grace of someone accustomed to carrying weight, her scrubs concealing faint scar tissue on her forearms that told stories of field medicine under fire. The hospital smells like every hospital, antiseptic layered over copper and desperation, but Laura has smelled worse. Remedy. 7 years ago. The scent stays with you. She clutches a tarnished challenge coin in her pocket during shift changes, her fingers finding its worn edges like a rosary, the metal smooth from 1,000 touches. Other nurses notice her peculiar focus on room 412, how she volunteers for that wing without explanation, how she studies the patient's pharmaceutical records with an intensity that seems excessive for someone with only 11 months at this hospital. The Green Beret in that room stares at ceiling tiles with vacant eyes, his traumatic brain injury erasing everything, his name, his rank, his family, everything except the woman standing beside his bed at 3 in the morning when the monitors wheezed their mechanical rhythm and nobody else was watching. She didn't know he couldn't remember her. She knew it. The distinction mattered. This morning, during grand rounds, Dr. Whitfield had made his demonstration. 23 residents circled his entourage like remoras around a shark, tablets glowing in their hands, their expressions carefully neutral as they waited to absorb whatever knowledge their attending deemed worthy. Laura stood at the periphery with her own chart documentation, waiting to present patient updates for the surgical recovery wing. Her patient care plan for a post-op cardiac patient sat open on the table, the one she'd spent 40 minutes refining, fluid intake calculations, medication timing protocols, vessel occlusion prevention. She'd caught a potential drug interaction that the original order had missed. A beta blocker and an ACE inhibitor at contraindicated doses for a patient with existing renal compromise. Whitfield picked up her chart like he was handling biological waste. Pedestrian thinking, he announced, his voice carrying the particular resonance of a man accustomed to authority. This entire care plan demonstrates exactly the kind of thinking that wastes hospital resources. A nurse with proper training wouldn't confuse basic pharmacology with medicine. He turned to the residents, his smile visible in his voice. This is what happens when protocol replaces critical analysis. Laura's jaw tightened. Imperceptibly. Her hands remained steady at her sides. Around her, resident faces flickered between recognition and cruelty. They understood he was performing, and performance required an audience to feel superior to. Whitfield continued, pointing at her for timing schedule with the practiced disdain of someone who'd never held a battlefield tourniquet, never calculated blood loss against time until seconds felt like currency. The vascular assessment alone, he gestured dismissively, shows a fundamental misunderstanding of post-operative priorities. She said nothing. She'd learned that silence could become armor if you wore it correctly. The rounds moved on. Whitfield's entourage followed him like a tide, and Laura remained where she was, absorbing the information without flinching. The resident who'd smirked the loudest, a woman named Dr. Hayes, maybe 28, still believing her education made her wise, looked away as Laura made eye contact. Not from shame. From recognition. The look that said, "You understand now that I'm beneath you, and that understanding should hurt." It didn't. 27 minutes later, Laura stood at the nurse's station updating medication records. The floor hummed with the afternoon shift change, phones ringing, monitors beeping from patient rooms, the ventilator in room 307 wheezing its rhythm like a sleeping animal. She was logging the post-op cardiac patient's fluid intake when she felt him before she saw him. Whitfield moved through the station with the air of someone accustomed to people parting around him. Bennett. Not a greeting. A summoning. She looked up. Her expression remained neutral, the mask that had survived 18 months of deployments, 3 tours of duty, 2 Purple Hearts earned by staying calm while everything around her tried to kill her. Doctor. He leaned against the counter, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive that probably cost more than her monthly rent. His eyes moved over her face with the contempt of a man examining something found on his shoe. I noticed you questioning my medication orders yesterday. The morphine escalation on post-op cardiac 7. His voice dropped, but the threat in it expanded. You don't question my orders. You don't suggest alternatives. You execute them. Do you understand? Laura met his gaze without blinking. I documented a concern about drug interaction given the patients. Your concern is noted and dismissed. He straightened, his voice hardening into something that would make residents nod frantically. You stick to vending machine duty since critical thinking seems beyond your scope. And if I hear that you've questioned my orders again, if I see one more note in a chart suggesting you think you know better than a physician, I will have security escort you out of this building. Personally. Do we have an understanding? The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere on another floor, a code blue announcement crackled through the intercom. Laura's hand rested on the keyboard, her finger steady, her breathing unchanged. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. Understood, Doctor, she said quietly. Whitfield held her gaze for 3 seconds, that moment where predators assess whether prey will run or comply. Then he turned and walked back toward his office, his white coat flaring slightly with his stride like he was parting water. Laura returned to her charting. She documented his medication override in the cardiac patient's chart with the same meticulous precision she'd learned in field medicine. Facts only. Objective observation. No editorial comment. No suggestion that his decisions were wrong. The chart was the truth, recorded for anyone with eyes to read it and the knowledge to understand what they were seeing. But that wasn't her primary concern. The man in room 412 wasn't post-operative. He was something else entirely, a complication that nobody at St. Michael's understood. Nobody except Laura. She finished her station documentation 42 minutes later, just as the day shift transitioned to evening, just as the hospital's noise level dropped from urgent to merely constant. The Green Beret's room sat at the end of the eastern corridor, his door cracked just enough to admit the hallway light without full visibility. She pushed it open slowly, her badge hanging at her hip, her tablet in hand, her entire posture communicating routine patient rounds. He was awake. His eyes tracked the ceiling fan rotating above his bed, round and round, the motor whispering its steady hum. She moved to his bedside, checking the 4 lines with a nurse's efficiency, but her eyes were on his face. Scar tissue on his left temple. A burn that had healed poorly, leaving his eyebrow asymmetrical. Dark hair cut military short, even after 7 years, even after the TBI that the doctor said would take 2 years minimum to recover from. His eyes didn't recognize her. She'd known this for 11 months. She'd accepted it the way you accept gravity, as a fact of the physical world that no amount of willingness could change. But acceptance and the feeling of it were different things. The feeling was something she'd learned to contain, to compress into the pocket of her scrubs alongside the tarnished challenge coin. How are we feeling today? She asked, keeping her voice in that register that nurses used, attentive but not intimate, professional but not distant. He didn't respond. His eyes continued tracking the ceiling fan. No voluntary commands recognized. No verbal response. The traumatic brain injury had left him locked inside a body that couldn't quite remember its own history. Laura checked his medication orders on the tablet. Whitfield's handwriting populated the pharmaceutical section, morphine escalations, propranolol dosing, an anticoagulant protocol that she wanted to verify against the patient's current renal function. The numbers didn't align correctly. She was almost certain of it. A dose calibrated for normal kidney function administered to a patient with documented creatinine elevation that suggested compromised filtration. She pulled up his complete medication history on the tablet, cross-referenced it against lab values from 3 days prior, and found what she was looking for. The renal function had declined. The medication doses had not been adjusted. Whitfield's orders, documented, signed, implemented. The kind of thing that could stop a heart. She waited until the evening shift was in full rotation, nurses moving through the corridors with purpose, physicians making rounds, the station phone ringing with its constant demand. The hallway outside room 412 emptied for exactly 90 seconds. Laura checked both directions, then pulled her phone from her pocket and photographed the medication discrepancies on her tablet screen. The numbers. The dates. The lab values. Evidence preserved in pixels. She didn't know that Dr. Whitfield had noticed. She didn't know he'd been watching from the physician's lounge, observing through the window wall while he pretended to review patient files. She didn't know he'd seen her studying the pharmaceutical records with military precision, photographing data, documenting details that a standard nurse would never have flagged. She didn't know that his expression had shifted from arrogance to calculation, that he'd immediately begun opening his secure phone, that his fingers were already typing names, board members with financial stakes in his supply contracts, administrators whose annual bonuses depended on maintaining the status quo, a private investigator he'd used before to bury inconvenient complications. What she did know was that the man in room 412 was dying slowly from medication protocols that didn't account for his declining renal function. What she did know was that Dr. Whitfield had ordered those protocols. What she did know was that she'd been placed at St. Michael's on a mission that required absolute invisibility, and now she was photographing evidence that could expose everything. The challenge coin in her pocket seemed heavier than it should have been. She finished her shift at 11 p.m., clocked out at the employee station, and walked toward the parking garage where her 15-year-old Civic waited under flickering fluorescent lights. The evening was cooling toward autumn, and rain had begun to fall in thin sheets that hissed against the asphalt. Her phone buzzed once in her pocket, a notification she didn't check. She drove home through empty Atlanta streets, her hand steady on the steering wheel, her breathing unchanged, her focus compartmentalized into the kind of discipline that only came from understanding that survival required not thinking about the things you couldn't change. The Green Beret would live or die based on whether Whitfield's medication protocols would be corrected. She'd documented the discrepancies. She'd photographed the evidence. She'd done everything protocol allowed her to do without drawing attention. Now she had to wait and see if it was enough. She had no idea that Whitfield was already building a file with her name on it. She had no idea that her access to the Green Beret's records had been noticed by the one person in the hospital with the authority and the motivation to bury her completely. She had no idea that being visible had become exponentially more dangerous than being invisible ever was. But something in her chest knew. Something in the scar tissue and muscle memory and instinct refined through 18 years of service understood that this was the moment everything changed. This was the point where the mission stopped being about staying hidden and started being about survival. The fluorescent lights of her apartment building seemed too bright when she pulled into the parking lot. She sat in her car for exactly 3 minutes before going inside, her challenge coin pressed against her palm, her mind already running contingencies for what came next. The fluorescent lights of the St. Michael's corridor hummed their mechanical rhythm as Laura moved through the halls with the calculated invisibility of someone trained to be a ghost. Room for 12 was her gravity now, pulling her back every shift, every rotation, the patient inside drawing her attention like a classified transmission she couldn't ignore. 7 years. The Green Beret had her name tattooed on his forearm, Cipher 7, the call sign that meant she carried him home through Ramadi, and now he stared through her with the hollow vacancy of traumatic brain injury, his brown eyes tracking nothing, recognizing no one. She documented his vitals with the same precision she'd once used to call in fire support coordinates. Temperature 37.8 Celsius. Heart rate 84, regular rhythm. Oxygen saturation solid at 98% on 2 liters. The numbers were clean. The medication orders were not. By Thursday morning, she'd photographed the pharmaceutical records 7 times. Not just photographed them, committed them to memory in the way a tactical operative commits an exit route, breaking them down into their component deceptions. The orders for the Green Beret's cardiac medications bore Whitfield's signature codes on every single authorization, yet the dosages climbed incrementally week by week, far beyond what the patient's condition required. She recognized the pattern from her Navy days, had seen similar schemes in field hospitals where supply contracts and kickback arrangements meant more to administrators than patient outcomes. The photographs were there to document what her memory had already catalogued. She stored the images in an encrypted folder on her personal phone using a VPN routed through 3 proxy servers, old habits, old protocols, the kind of operational security that kept you alive when systems failed. What she didn't see was Whitfield watching her from the nursing station's observation window, his eyes narrowing as she photographed the chart one more time, her phone screen catching the afternoon light. He saw the deliberate framing of each image, the way she angled the pages to capture specific prescriptions, the methodical repetition that screamed investigation. His jaw tightened. She was building a case. The thought arrived with the certainty of a diagnosis, and Whitfield's response was immediate and tactical. He pulled out his personal phone, the one without hospital records, the one with direct lines to the people who'd made this lucrative arrangement possible, and made the first call at 3:06 p.m. Conrad Pike, Finance Committee. Listen, we have a situation developing. Whitfield's voice carried the tone of a man accustomed to being heard. One of the floor nurses, Laura Bennett, appears to be documenting irregularities in pharmaceutical orders. I'm being proactive here. I need to establish a personnel file before this becomes a problem. The kind of problem that touches everyone on the supply contract committee. The pause was deliberate, allowing Pike to understand exactly which committee, which contracts, which kickback arrangements might be jeopardized if a nurse with access to the medical records decided to escalate her concerns. I'm thinking we move fast. Discrepancies in her credentials, perhaps. Something that discredits her before she can discredit the system. The second call came at 4:12 p.m. Dr. Marcus Hayes, Chief of Surgery, a man whose department had received 17% budget increases courtesy of Whitfield supply arrangements. Hayes, Whitfield. I need your discretion, and I need it now. That Navy nurse on my unit, Bennett, she's become a liability. I need you to file a complaint with the state board. Impersonation of credentials, scope violation, something that makes her radioactive before she connects dots she has no business connecting. Hayes didn't ask questions. Men like Hayes understood leverage. Men like Hayes understood that the board review that might follow would be motivated by personal interest rather than fact-finding. By 5 p.m., Whitfield had made 4 calls. The board members with financial stakes in the medical supply contracts that his authorization codes fed into. The administrator who'd approved the budget increases. The compliance officer who'd somehow never noticed the pattern discrepancies that Laura had caught in her first 6 months. Each conversation was surgical, precise, designed to activate a network of self-interest that would mobilize to protect itself. By the time Laura clocked out that evening, the machinery of institutional power was already turning in her direction, grinding toward a conclusion that no single floor nurse could possibly survive. She didn't know any of this yet. She was focused on the patient, on the Green Beret whose chart told a story of systematically inflated medications masking a theft so methodical it had probably been running for 3 years or more. She pulled up his latest EKG printout in the break room, her trained eye catching something the residents had missed, a subtle irregularity in the ST segment, the kind of arrhythmia that could cascade into something catastrophic if the dosage continued. The medication he was receiving was supposed to prevent this. Instead, it was creating the conditions for it. She documented her observation in the electronic record, flagging it for physician review, knowing exactly how many chances she had before someone decided her concerns were an annoyance rather than a legitimate clinical observation. The Green Beret lay in bed number 412, his hands resting on top of the blanket, and she could see the tattoo clearly from the doorway. Her call sign, Cipher 7, inked in military block letters on his forearm, a permanent reminder of a mission that had nearly killed both of them. She dragged him through a kilometer of hostile fire in Ramadi, her hands locked in his body armor, both of them bleeding, both of them moving on rage and adrenaline and the kind of survival instinct that only emerged when everything else had failed. She'd made it to the extraction point. She'd gotten him to the medevac. She'd held pressure on his wounds while Rotor Wash blasted sand across them both. And then her orders had changed, and she'd never seen him again until he'd arrived at St. Michael's under a different name, assigned to the cardiac unit by routing decisions she couldn't trace and didn't want to question. Some missions didn't end. They just changed theater. His eyes opened as she approached, the mechanical motion of someone waking rather than someone recognizing. No flash of awareness. No moment where his mind caught the name on her badge and synchronized it with the word inked on his arm. The traumatic brain injury had stolen that. Theft of a different kind, she thought. She checked his monitors. The rhythm was still regular, but that ST segment irregularity nagged at her. She paged the resident, documented her clinical concern about delaying the scheduled cardiac catheterization, recommended observation for a minimum of 48 hours. The resident called back 17 minutes later. Bennett, that's a routine procedure. The attending has already cleared it. We're moving forward as scheduled. She didn't argue. Arguments created patterns. Patterns created documentation of insubordination. She had to remain invisible long enough for the system to expose itself, which meant accepting dismissals and appearing compliant while she built the real case, the one that wouldn't depend on her testimony, the one that would speak itself through numbers and dates and Whitfield's own signature authorization codes. But the machinery was already in motion against her, and she had no idea how many hours remained before impact. The monitors told a story nobody else was reading. Laura pulled the vitals from the Green Beret's chart on morning 6, her eyes tracking the same pattern she'd been documenting for 11 days, subtle arrhythmia spikes at exactly 3:56 a.m. every cycle, consistent as a metronome. The medication logs didn't match the EKG data. Someone had ordered a QT-prolonging drug cocktail that shouldn't exist in the same bloodstream, and the dosages kept increasing on Whitfield's authorization codes. She photographed the latest readout with her phone, her hand steady as surgical steel, aware that the machinery was already turning against her but unable to stop the mission. The challenge coin pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat through her scrub pocket. The Green Beret's eyes remained unfocused as she checked his pressure, 120/76, stable, too stable for a patient being chemically destabilized. She wanted to speak to him, to tell him who she was, what Ramadi meant, why his name was tattooed on her forearm beneath the uniform, but the mission required silence. It required becoming invisible. She logged the vitals and left the room moving like a ghost, aware that someone was watching the watcher now. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical hymn as she passed the nurse's station, and she felt the weight of Whitfield's attention like a sniper's scope tracking her back. By 11:43 a.m., everything fractured. The Green Beret was scheduled for a routine cardiac catheterization, diagnostic only, low risk, standard procedure. Laura assisted as Whitfield entered the cath lab wearing his authority-like expensive cologne, radiating the casual confidence of a man whose network insulated him from consequences. She'd positioned herself at the monitor banks, watching the EKG tracing across the screen in real time, when the first irregular beat scrolled past. Then another. Then the pattern began fragmenting like a phone screen hit with a hammer. Ventricular fibrillation. The Green Beret's body seized on the table. His monitor erupted into the electronic screen that meant cardiac arrest. Whitfield froze at the crash cart. Actually froze. His hands hung in space like he'd forgotten how to move them, and in that crystalline moment, that single, terrible second of hesitation, Laura saw the architecture of his incompetence. A man who'd built his reputation on protocol and positioning, not on the muscle memory of keeping people alive. She didn't think. She moved. The scalpel came from the crash cart's trauma tray, a size 10 blade that felt like an old friend returning to her palm. Her body remembered Ramadi, the forward surgical team, the medics bay under mortar fire, the feeling of cracking a ribcage open under firelight while sand rained from the ceiling. Her training had never left. It had only been sleeping. She positioned the blade at the 5th intercostal space, mid-axillary line, and pressed down with the kind of focused violence that looks like surgery when you've done it right. Blood welled up dark and arterial, and muscle memory screamed awake inside her chest. Someone gasped. Whitfield's voice rose in protest, something about protocol violation, but Laura was already past words. She was back in a place where seconds measured in corpses. The ribs opened like a door. She placed her gloved hand directly against the Green Beret's silent heart and began compressions, each one precise as a surgeon's stitch, each one pulling blood through a chamber that had forgotten how to beat. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm behind her. 1 compression. 2. The monitor still screamed flatline. 3. 4. 5. Muscle memory had a clock all its own, and it said for minutes before brain death became permanent. She'd carried him through a kilometer of hostile fire once. She could carry him back from this. The Green Beret's heart was smaller than she remembered. Softer. She could feel it collapsing under her palm, barely a thing at all, just muscle and electrical failure and the weight of 7 years without recognition. She pushed harder. 7 years since she'd pulled him out of Ramadi bleeding through 3 separate wounds, since she'd held pressure against his chest while rounds came down like biblical rain, since she'd kept him talking so he wouldn't sedate into shock. "Stay with me," she'd told him then, her voice like a wire under tension. She pushed. Again. Again. The second stretched like pulled taffy. 60 compressions per minute. The metronome of salvation. Her shoulders burned. Her forearms felt welded to bone. She compressed with the kind of desperation that only came from having already failed once, from walking away from Ramadi thinking she'd left someone behind, from spending 7 years wondering if the man she'd saved had died anyway, somewhere quiet, in some hospital the military never reported. 70 seconds. 80. 120. 240. At 240 seconds, exactly 4 minutes, the monitor hiccuped. A single beat. Irregular. Desperate. Real. The Green Beret's chest expanded under her palms as the ventilator kicked in, and his heart found a rhythm like a man stumbling back into consciousness. Sinus rhythm. The word moved through the room like a prayer that had landed. Blood pressure climbing. 70. 80. 90. 100. The monitors spoke the language of the living again. Laura's hands didn't shake. She'd never learned how. She sutured the thoracotomy with the kind of precision that belonged in a teaching hospital, interrupted nylon sutures through muscle and ribs, each knot tight as a SEAL team's grip, each movement automatic and exact, and pulled from 7 years of carrying this man's name on her forearm like a mission that never ended. The Green Beret's eyes remained unconscious, his face still as stone, beautiful in the way broken people were beautiful. She could feel his heartbeat through the sutures, irregular still but real, the electrical command sending blood out to every cell that had almost forgotten how to hope. The security officers entered the cath lab with their hands open and their expressions already apologetic. "Administration needs to see you immediately." Not a request. She'd heard enough command voices to know the difference. Whitfield stood beside the patient he'd frozen over, his phone still in hand, his face rearranged into a mask of concern that didn't touch his eyes. "I had no choice but to report the unauthorized surgical procedure," he said to the room, his voice heavy with a regret that tasted like copper and lies. "Patient safety protocols exist for a reason." The residents exchanged glances behind their tablets. The perfusionist suddenly found something fascinating on her screen. Nobody spoke. Laura stripped her gloves without comment, peeling the latex away from her hands with the kind of calm that only came from having already accepted the cost. The challenge coin pressed against her ribs as she walked between the security officers, her shoulders back, her jaw level, aware that every witness in the room had watched her resurrect a corpse and none of them would testify to it. The suspension paperwork was waiting in the administrator's office on the 3rd floor. Gross insubordination. Unauthorized surgical procedure. Endangerment of patient. Her nursing license suspended pending investigation, effective immediately. Laura signed the documents in silence, her pen moving across the page like she was signing away someone else's life, and maybe she was. She handed over her badge, the plastic worn soft from 11 months of wear, from 11 months of remaining invisible. Her fingers brushed the challenge coin one more time through her scrub pocket, a tactical habit that belonged to someone she wasn't supposed to be anymore. The administrator's eyes held something like sympathy, but sympathy didn't matter. What mattered was the machinery that had already begun turning without her consent. By that evening, Whitfield's network was moving with the efficiency of something well-practiced. He called the board members whose bonuses depended on his supply contracts, fabricated personnel files thick with complaints she'd never triggered, contacted a private investigator to probe her Navy references for anything questionable, anything that could reframe her rescue as fraud. The anonymous complaint to the state board went out at 8:13 p.m., allegations of falsified credentials, fraudulent credentials, practicing medicine without a license. By morning, the references from her Navy service had been contacted. By afternoon, the termination papers arrived. Laura read them at her kitchen table, still wearing her scrubs, the fabric damp in places she didn't want to examine. The tarnished challenge coin from Ramadi lay beside the termination letter, its worn edges catching the afternoon light. Gross insubordination. Practitioner impersonation. Your access to St. Michael's is permanently revoked. Her 14-year-old son found her sitting there, still in uniform, still holding the coin, still staring at a document that said she'd failed. His drotk uniform hung in his closet upstairs, the uniform he'd chosen because she'd spent so many years being invisible, because he wanted to understand what invisible meant. Mom. His voice cracked with the kind of confusion that only came from seeing your parents' armor develop a fissure. Why are you home early? She couldn't answer him. She couldn't explain that she'd chosen a soldier's life over her cover, that she'd broken protocol to save a man who would never know her name, that she'd traded everything she'd built in Atlanta for 4 minutes of muscle memory in a cath lab. The tears came quiet and efficient, the way soldiers cried when nobody was watching, when it wouldn't affect mission readiness. But the mission was over now. And she had no idea what happened next. Security entered the cath lab with expressions that said everything. Apologetic. Uncomfortable. Orders from above. The charge nurse wouldn't meet Laura's eyes as she moved toward the operating table, her hand still gloved, still steady, the Green Beret's chest rising and falling beneath the ventilator's mechanical rhythm. Ms. Bennett, administration needs to see you immediately. Not a request. The tone made that clear. Laura stripped her gloves, her movements precise, mechanical, the same efficiency that had carried wounded soldiers through open fire now carrying her toward her own collapse, though her face remained a glacier. She followed them into the corridor, the fluorescent lights overhead casting everything in that sickly institutional white that made time feel suspended. The administration office occupied the 3rd floor, all mahogany and diplomas, the kind of space designed to make people feel small. The director sat behind a desk that cost more than Laura's monthly salary, his fingers steepled with the posture of someone about to deliver a sentence he'd practiced in the mirror. Your license is suspended, effective immediately, pending a full investigation into unauthorized surgical procedures performed outside your scope of practice. His voice carried the rehearsed weight of someone reading from a legal document. We've contacted the state nursing board. You'll need to comply with their review process. Laura's hands didn't shake. Her jaw didn't clench visibly. She simply stood there, absorbing the institutional hammer blow with the same stoic acceptance that had kept her alive in Ramadi when everything around her turned to fire and sound. Security will escort you from the building now. You may collect personal items from your locker, nothing more. The security guard, a man she'd smiled at every morning for 11 months, wouldn't look at her face. He walked 2 steps behind as they descended to the basement locker room, his posture broadcasting his discomfort like a radio signal. Laura retrieved her jacket, left her stethoscope coiled on the shelf like a dead snake, and felt the weight of the tarnished challenge coin in her scrub pocket as they walked toward the employee exit. The parking lot was rain-slicked, the afternoon Atlanta heat bearing down like a physical force. The security guard stopped at the threshold of the automatic doors. For what it's worth, he said quietly, still not meeting her eyes, I saw the monitor data. You saved his life. She nodded once. Didn't speak. The words locked in her chest belonged to classified debriefings, not parking lot conversations with middle-aged security guards who were just following orders. She drove home in silence, the radio off, nothing but the hiss of the air conditioning and the sound of her own breathing, steady and controlled as a sniper's. But that wasn't the worst part. Dr. Whitfield's network moved with surgical precision. By the next morning, the state nursing board had received an anonymous complaint from a private investigator Whitfield had retained, allegations of falsified credentials, claims that her nursing certifications were fraudulent, insinuations that she'd somehow obtained her license through deception. The investigator's report was thorough, professional, and entirely fabricated, built on selective documentation and twisted timelines, the kind of destruction that only wealthy men with institutional allies could orchestrate. They contacted her Navy references. Officers who'd worked with her classified unit in Ramadi had to choose, confirm her credentials and risk exposing classified operations, or remain silent and let the machinery grind. Most chose silence. Classification restrictions created perfect cover for institutional assassination. By evening of the second day, her termination papers arrived via certified mail. Gross insubordination. Practitioner impersonation. Scope violations. Each line a careful brick in a wall designed to ensure no hospital would ever hire her again, no licensing board would ever reinstate her, her professional identity cremated in a controlled burn orchestrated by a man she'd embarrassed in front of residents. Laura sat at her kitchen table on day 3, still wearing her scrubs because she hadn't found the energy to change. The tarnished challenge coin from Ramadi rested in her palm, worn smooth by 7 years of constant handling, a weight that had once been comfort and now felt like a stone from the grave of her cover identity. Through the window, the Atlanta afternoon was slipping into evening, shadows lengthening across the backyard like reaching fingers. Her son found her there at 5:15, home from his DROT program, his uniform still crisp from the day's drills. He was 14 years old with his father's height and her bone structure, and his face shifted through confusion to something darker as he registered her stillness, the official document spread across the table, the way her eyes didn't track when he entered the room. "Mom, what happened? Why are you home?" She couldn't find the words that would make sense. Couldn't explain that her mission had a shelf life, that staying invisible required perfect execution and perfect luck, that luck had run out the moment she'd cracked an open chest and remembered who she was. Couldn't tell him about classified operations in Ramadi 7 years ago, about carrying soldiers through hostile fire, about identities that were supposed to be permanent until the moment they weren't. "I lost my job," she said quietly. That much was true. His jaw tightened the way hers did when she was processing threat assessment. "Why? You're the best nurse there." "It's complicated, sweetheart." He didn't push. Something in her tone made clear this conversation had depth charges waiting in water he wasn't old enough to navigate. He set his uniform cap on the counter, the DROT insignia catching the fading light, and when she glanced at her phone 20 minutes later, a news alert glowed against the black screen. St. Michael's Hospital announces enhanced safety protocols following patient care incident. Dr. Whitfield, the headline promised, would discuss the dangerous intersection of nursing scope creep and physician oversight at tomorrow's press conference. Her phone buzzed again. And again. Social media notifications. News outlets picking up the story. The narrative Whitfield had seeded through his network was spreading like wildfire: dangerous nurse, physician heroism, systemic oversight failures. He was turning her into a cautionary tale, a template for why women shouldn't play doctor, why military experience didn't translate to civilian medicine, why discipline required hierarchy and hierarchy required subservience. That night, she heard her son moving in the basement around 2 in the morning. The sound of boxes shifting. The creak of the old wooden shelf where she kept her pre-deployment gear, the things she'd packed away 7 years ago when Laura Bennett, nurse, had replaced whatever she'd been before. She didn't go check. Part of her already knew what he'd found, and some missions required letting your team move without surveillance. The press conference assembled at St. Michael's main lobby the next afternoon at 3 o'clock, local news cameras positioned like snipers in windows, their lenses tracking Dr. Whitfield as he moved through the space in his white coat, looking every inch the heroic physician who'd nearly been undermined by a rogue nurse with delusions of surgical competence. Hospital administrators flanked him, lending institutional weight to his narrative. The Green Beret from room 412 wasn't present, probably still sedated, still recovering from the procedure that had nearly killed him, unaware that the woman who'd saved his life was being publicly dismantled. Laura watched from her car in the parking lot, windows up, engine off, unable to look away from the slow-motion destruction of 7 years of careful anonymity. Her phone was off. Her civilian clothes felt like a costume. She was reviewing extraction protocols, how to move her son somewhere safe, how to create a new cover identity, how to disappear again, when the lobby doors opened. He walked through in full DROT dress uniform, 14 years old and moving with a soldier's precision, the shadow box held in both hands like an offering at an altar. Her son. carrying the thing she'd buried in basement darkness, and the world seemed to compress into a single terrible beautiful moment. His voice cut through the lobby with surprising clarity. "Mom, they need to see these." The room went dead silent. Cameras swiveled. Whitfield's words died mid-sentence. A veteran security guard stepped forward, not the same one from the employee exit, someone older, someone whose bearing suggested decades of service, and his eyes fixed on the insignia, the medals catching the camera flashes with terrible clarity. His voice cracked, "Master Chief Petty Officer. Navy." Laura understood then that nothing was invisible anymore, that the coin she'd worn in her pocket for 7 years had finally completed its mission, not to keep her secret but to ensure, when the moment came, that the truth would be undeniable. The press conference hadn't just been interrupted. It had been weaponized by a child who understood, at a level most adults never reached, that sometimes the only way to save your mother was to blow her cover in front of live television cameras. She stepped out of her car and walked toward the lobby doors as news anchors scrambled to understand what was happening, as Whitfield's carefully constructed narrative began to collapse like a building with its load-bearing wall removed, as her son's fierce protective rage became permanent record, broadcast to every news outlet in Atlanta and beyond. The tarnished challenge coin remained in her scrub pocket as she entered the building. She'd spent 7 years staying quiet so the mission would hold. It was time to become loud. The gymnasium doors burst open and the veteran security guard froze. His eyes landed on the shadow box first, the ribbons arranged in precise order, each one catching the fluorescent light like a beacon he thought he'd never see again outside of Arlington. His hands trembled as he stepped forward, and every person in the room sensed the shift. The air pressure changed. Something enormous was about to break open. "Master Chief Petty Officer," he rasped, his voice cracking like a radio operator receiving a message after years of static. The words didn't sound like a question. They sounded like recognition that had been waiting 14 years to speak itself aloud. The gymnasium went silent. Reporters lowered their phones. Dr. Whitfield's expression froze mid-smile, the confidence draining from his face like someone had pulled a plug. The Green Beret didn't move from his wheelchair at first. Then his hands gripped the armrests and he pushed himself upright, his legs unsteady but his spine straight, the muscle memory of military bearing overriding the tremor in his limbs. He stared directly at Laura, and when he spoke, his voice was rough from months of disuse but crystalline in its precision. "Cipher 7, he rasped. The room didn't go silent. Silence is passive. This was something else entirely, a held breath, a collective understanding that the floor had shifted beneath their feet. The call sign hung in the air like a detonation code. Only 7 people on Earth had known that designation. 7 people who'd operated in Ramadi during the summer of 2017, moving through streets that didn't appear on maps, conducting missions that wouldn't be declassified for another decade. Laura's son gripped the shadow box tighter, his 14-year-old mind suddenly understanding why his mother kept the basement door locked, why she'd never spoken about what was in that locked footlocker, why she came home some nights with sand in her bootlaces that didn't match any beach in Georgia. The 2-star general in attendance stood slowly. His aide handed him a tablet, and the general's reading glasses came up to his eyes with the precision of someone accustomed to parsing classified documents. He'd been invited to St. Michael's to oversee the investigation into Whitfield's kickback scheme. The VA had 3 complaints from other facilities, all involving the same pharmaceutical supplier, all authorized by physicians connected to Whitfield's network. But he hadn't expected this. "Bronze Star," the general said, reading from the declassified file now displayed on the tablet screen. His voice filled the gymnasium the way military authority fills a room, not with volume, but with absolute weight. "Silver Star." Pause. The room breathed in. "Second Silver Star." Another pause, longer this time. Everyone watching understood they were hearing her combat record in real time, each medal its own sentence, each recognition a layer of truth peeling back. "And a Navy Cross," the general finished. The silence lasted exactly 10 seconds. Someone in the back started to cry. The general continued reading, his voice steady as a compass point, "For actions during Operation Artemis Actual, Ramadi, July 2017. Under heavy fire, Master Chief Bennett extracted 3 wounded personnel across 1 kilometer of hostile territory, including 1 special operations casualty with life-threatening torso injuries. Direct contact with enemy forces ongoing. Her actions prevented casualty escalation and enabled mission completion. The medical school professor in Boston was watching the live stream on his laptop, coffee cooling beside him in his faculty office overlooking Beacon Hill. He taught pediatrics for 32 years and recognized arrogance the way a radiologist recognizes a tumor, immediately and with absolute certainty. He taught Whitfield in medical school, watched the young physician's brilliant mind coupled with a fundamental absence of humility. He'd written a letter of recommendation because Whitfield's scores were exceptional, not because he believed in the man's character. That letter haunted him. The professor watched Dr. Whitfield's frozen smile, watched him understand that his moment of triumph was collapsing in real time, and something in the professor's chest shifted from regret to responsibility. He opened Twitter on his phone and began typing with the fury of someone whose mistake had now cost a decorated officer her career. The Green Beret moved then, that same fluid grace that had carried him through Helmand Province now moving him to his feet with Laura's assistance. Their hands touched for the first time in 7 years, and his fingers held steady. The wheelchair rolled backward. He was standing. The room held that image like a photograph. Then he rolled up his sleeve. The tattoo was fresh-looking despite being 7 years old, crisp black line spelling out a name beneath 2 words arranged like a mission statement, "She carried me home." Someone gasped. Someone else was recording with their phone, the camera capturing the image of her call sign permanently etched on his forearm in ink that couldn't be redacted or denied. The room suddenly understood that this wasn't institutional recognition. This was personal honor. This was a warrior saying, "This woman saved my life twice, once in Ramadi and once here in Atlanta, and my body will carry that truth until I die." The professor in Boston hit send on his tweet at 5:19 a.m. "I taught Dr. Whitfield medicine, but clearly failed to teach him honor. I do not recognize the man in that video. My apologies to Master Chief Bennett for writing a letter that let him into this profession." The tweet had 47,000 retweets by 6:08 a.m. By 9 a.m., the hospital board had convened an emergency session. By noon, auditors had requested Whitfield's pharmaceutical authorization records from the past 4 years. By 3 p.m., DOD investigators who'd been watching St. Michael's supply patterns for 18 months suddenly received clearance from the Pentagon to share their evidence. The files Laura had been documenting, the inflated orders, the vendors with suspicious pricing structures, the kickback vulnerable contracts, were now admissible in federal court. The video went viral at 11:34 a.m. 3 million views by evening. 20 million by midnight. News outlets worldwide picked up the story, decorated veteran humiliated and fired by arrogant physician who'd frozen during the very crisis she resolved. The contrast was too clean, too perfectly narrative. It would not be forgotten. Dr. Whitfield's mentor publicly disavowed him. His former colleagues stopped taking his calls. His board member allies suddenly discovered urgent business in other states. Federal prosecutors arrived on day 4, their briefcases fat with evidence, their questions surgical in their precision. The anonymous complaint about Laura's credentials had originated from Whitfield's office IP address. The fabricated charges collapsed under 3 hours of investigation. The state medical board initiated emergency review of his license. His network, which had seemed impregnable 3 days earlier, evaporated like morning fog. Within 6 months, his peers who'd protected him for years were too busy protecting themselves to offer any protection at all. Someone sent Laura a photograph. It arrived without a return address, but she knew who'd sent it. The general, probably, or someone on his team. The image showed Dr. Whitfield in a gymnasium much smaller than St. Michael's, standing before a class of bored teenagers, a CPR mannequin beside him, his face older than it should have been. He was making $15 an hour teaching basic life support to people who didn't know they were learning from someone who'd once destroyed the career of a woman who'd saved a life the way he'd attempted to destroy it. His medical license was gone. Permanently revoked. His name would never be printed on a hospital roster again. The kickback scheme had unraveled into federal charges, a plea deal that saved him from prison by destroying everything else: his practice, his reputation, his future. The quiet professional had defeated the arrogant one, not with violence or revenge, but with truth. 8 months later, Laura stood in the East Room of the White House in dress whites, a uniform showing the ribbon she'd kept hidden for so long, each one a mission that had required her to stay invisible. Her son stood in the front row holding the tarnished challenge coin, understanding now why his mother had carried it through every impossible night. The president shook her hand with both of his, the cameras capturing the moment a hidden warrior finally came home. The Green Beret stood beside her in dress blues, his memory restored through months of intensive therapy, his career rebuilt around training the next generation of operators. He'd asked to be present for this, the woman who'd carried him home twice now being honored by the nation for both acts of carrying. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together, Laura said in her acceptance remarks, her voice steady as a surgical laser, her composure complete. She held the Distinguished Service Medal in hands that had held lives together, in hands that had stayed steady through fire, in hands that had never trembled even when the world demanded they break. Thank you all for watching. If you believe in honoring the quiet professionals among us, the warriors who serve without recognition, please subscribe and leave a comment about the heroes you've known who never wore their strength on their sleeves.
Have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value?